Dzień dobry Państwu, witamy
Good
Państwa
morning,
bardzo
ladies
serdecznie
and
na
gentlemen.
specjalnym
Welcome
briefingu
at
prasowym
the
Międzynarodowy
special press
Dzień
briefing
Praw Człowieka.
on
To
an
chyba najlepszy
International
moment na
Human
przekazanie w
Rights
Państwa ręce
Day, and it is the
niezwykle
best
ważnej
moment
publikacji
to
opracowanej
share
przez
an important
Freemuse.
publication
Freemuse jest
with you.
niezależną
This was
międzynarodową
worked by
organizacją pozarządową
Freemuse, which is
działającą
a
na rzecz praw
non-governmental
człowieka, wolności
organization
słowa i
working
ekspresji
for
artystycznej
human
oraz
rights, freedom of
różnorodności
speech
kulturowej.
and artistic
Organizacja
freedom
posiada specjalny
and
status
cultural
doradczy
diversity.
ONZ przy Radzie
It has
Gospodarczej
the
i Społecznej advisory status for the UN and for the UNESCO. On international scale, Freemuse documents the violation of artistic freedom in many countries of the world, collaborating with artists and cultural organizations and activists. It supports artists who are persecuted in their country with regards to their gender, race or sexual orientation. Today's premiere of this report takes place in Krakow. We will return to that reason in a moment. Our press briefing today and the event that follows connects the presentation of the report, the presentation of the initiatives and a debate together with artistic program are streamlined on YouTube and Play Krakow. Let me welcome our English-speaking guests. Welcome to our guests on the Freemuse YouTube channel. We will be holding this media briefing in Polish and it will be translated to English for your benefit, but the second part of the day will be held in English throughout. Proszę pozwolić, że już teraz zapraszam do rozmowy naszych gości,
today our guests. This is Professor Andrzej Kulig, the first deputy of the City Mayor of Krakow for Social Policy, Ms. Nina Gabryś, the head of the Office for Equal Treatment, and Srirak Pilipit, the Executive Director of Freemuse. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We are observing the social distance so we can take off the masks for the purposes of this debate. Mr. Mayor, why Krakow? Is it important, is it significant for our city that this international report is published and announced here in Krakow? Yes, it is really important for us. And there are a few reasons for it. First of all, let me tell you that the most beautiful period in the history of our town, of our city, started with the beginning of Renaissance and humanism. And Renaissance ideas are tolerance, equality and freedom. Moreover, our city, as very few cities in Poland, is a multicultural city with mutual respect, tolerance and also equal treatment. They are priorities for the good collaboration of all residents. And what is more, our city is a melting pot of various cultures. We have many cultural institutions which in an ongoing way express the principles of equal treatment of all people irrespectively of all differences, in the way full of dignity. Mr. Mayor, within the last years, would I exaggerate if I said that many things happened in Poland within the context of the Freemuse report, or is it a stable and calm process? This is a very well asked question. Certainly many things have happened recently, both good and bad things. Bad things because we have various demons of stupidity which appear, and they are also present in untrue and persecuting, cruel, inhumane acts of various types committed against the people who might differ from the majority. But also, on the other hand, perhaps this leads to the fact that we have the counterbalance for these acts of violence, because in an increasingly larger group of our people, Polish people, there is a strong disagreement for these acts. And this is a hope for me, to see that there are so many young people who reject this narrative. Thank you very much. Srirak.
Allow me to thank on behalf of everyone in this room, in this studio at ICE Krakow Congress Centre, for actually taking the trouble to physically join us at this event, at this press briefing. It's not an easy time to travel. We all know that. So special thank you to you. Srirak, tell us, why Krakow?
Thank you very much. It's a trouble worth taking the time to do. And thank you very much for the mayor also to be here with us. We picked Krakow basically because in the context where nationalism, populism are growing in many parts of the world, including in Poland here, where over 80 local governments has announced LGBT ideology-free zone. And it's basically raising alarm bells in many parts of the world, not only that it violates human rights principles in the first place, especially on the ground of equality and non-discrimination. It also creates a climate of fears. Even some of these announcements are not legally binding. They still send a message to all the parts in the society. And this makes life very difficult for artists, whether it's LGBT or not in the country. So when we discussed with the City of Krakow and having heard the reputation of being liberal city, stand with human rights principle, then we start to have conversation, and bits by bits, I think we have this event happening in Krakow. So it's a pleasure for us to actually be able to do this in Poland, when in many parts of Poland, challenges has been quite obvious. And with that, we thank for the leadership of the city, indeed.
And once again, thank you for joining us. Nino, czy mógłbym zapytać, ty myślisz o tym połączeniu Kraków, doświadczenie miasta dotychczasowe w tematyce, którą podejmuje raport, i sama organizacja tego rodzaju partnerstwa, co przychodzi ci do głowy w pierwszej kolejności?
Comes to your mind? I believe that today's event is an exceptional moment when the equality policy initiated by Krakow some time ago is placed in a long-term perspective within our urban policy, and culture is a very important tool through which we would like to build this way of sensitivity. And I believe that culture is in this perspective a special space for freedom to express oneself, to create a dialogue, and the culture that builds bridges and that supports, that provides solidarity. It is the culture that we would like to create in Krakow, and today's event is the onset of the creation of such sensibility. And your post is relatively new. Can I ask you whether there was a special incentive to create it, special consideration that justified such a function in Krakow? I believe that given the split, the polarization of the society concerning these issues, cities bear special responsibility for building equality policy and building the awareness about the priority of human rights, priority that should be given to human rights, that equality issues should not be separated from local governments, because it is local governments that that should look after people who should be protected against discrimination. Ladies and gentlemen, the report is premiered today, so I believe that the majority of you probably has not seen it yet, but today, during the press briefing, we would like the most important statistics to be presented in this debate.
May I kindly ask you just to give us the key highlights from the report? I know we will be covering more of those in the second half of the day, but could you just give us a taste of what kind of statistics and data we are talking about? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to briefly highlight some of the findings of this report. But first of all, in the past several years, as many of us know, Freemuse has documented censorship and violation of artistic freedom from around the world. We document from 93 countries, And the report, which is known as the State of Artistic Freedom Report, has been our annual research report that's been widely used in many parts of the world. Based on this report, we found that LGBT artists are particularly vulnerable to attacks and other forms of artistic freedom restriction. So in the past 1.5 years, we reviewed over 140 cases and look at what actually happened to LGBT artists around the world in 40 countries. And what we found is that many governments have used various kinds of laws to restrict LGBT artists' freedom of expression, especially when it comes to arts and culture. And this comes to broadly 3 forms of restrictions legally. First, over 70 countries remain criminalize homosexuality, and this really makes it very difficult for artists to do their work, to have access to resources, as well as platforms to show their artwork. Other countries use criminal codes, where restrictions that come for each country has been quite limited. And the third form, which is quite an alarming one, and that is the anti-LGBT propaganda laws. There are 35 countries that has this law. But what's alarming is in the past 10 years, we've seen 17 countries just pass this law. Some of them already have criminalized homosexuality, others have not has. But this basically take any debates on LGBT out of the society. I'm going to quickly show you some of the slides here, and this will be just a small part of the presentation we're going to give in about an hour from now. So first of all, based on the cases that we review, 53% of violations are from governments, and 16% are from the artistic communities. And artistic communities here means festival, arts gallery, and other platform, as well as arts organization themselves. We've seen not much difference whether in countries where homosexuality is criminalized or not. Around 40% of violations happen in countries without criminalization of homosexuality, and 55% happen in countries that criminalize homosexuality. And 48%, this is related to countries with propaganda law. Some of the art forms we've seen slightly change. Films has been #1 types of art forms that's being silenced when it comes to LGBT artists or by artists that work simply on LGBT theme. Music comes second. Normally music will be up first in most of the other category, followed by theater. It's worth mentioning also that what make LGBT movement grow very slowly in terms of their freedom of expression is the process of abnormalizing LGBT expression itself. WHO has just recognized that sexual orientation is not something wrong in terms of health process, and that's in 1992. And just this year, when WHO or the World Health Organization acknowledged that gender identity and gender reconformity as the mental order, that perception has just been lifted, very recent. And this fuels conversation or debate that LGBT is one form of sickness in terms of health. Countries like Egypt, for example, will call LGBT as a disease. And this basically helps fuel challenges in terms of realizing LGBT freedom of expression. We've seen, based on our assessments, government use at least 3 forms of silencing LGBT artists. First of all, many governments claim that any LGBT arts violate public morals or challenging public morals. Others claim that this violates traditional family values. Another will use this as a harmful work to children, when very often this has basically taken away children's rights to learn about their sexuality. And at the same time, traditional values move away a debate, which is the basis for plural society. When 70 countries criminalize homosexuality, they basically denied identity of LGBT person and artists. They also interference private life of individuals. At the same time, they help fuels violence in many parts of the country. And because of this criminalizing homosexuality, it promotes violence. It makes artists, LGBT artists, have less access to resources, including funding and platform to show their work. They also find it difficult to find partners when LGBT is not allowed in the country, and it creates a livelihood for many artists. This is one of the big part that we have experienced. And these are the new propaganda laws that's just been introduced in the past 10 years. We list the countries here, and hope you can actually see it on your screen. You will see that this happened in Muslim countries, as well as in Buddhist countries, as well as in Christians. The propaganda law basically take away any media or exposures of artistic freedom by LGBT artists, and it's basically take away the very basic rights of artists, especially LGBT artists. It's also have direct effect on many of the art forms, that's including any scenes that show women kissing women, for example, is not allowed at all. And many, even for the fictional characters, that is not allowed, and in other forms of arts also. So those are some of the basic findings that we would like to present. I'll be happy to speak a little bit more if you have time on the Poland situation. We launched the report on the state of artistic freedom in Europe before, and Poland has featured quite highly in this report. And that's the deterioration of artistic freedom in Poland, from not only the LGBT-free zone, but also the specific artists and people in arts and culture organizations that have been persecuted on the ground of hurting religious feelings. And these grounds are inconsistent with human rights standards in the first place. So these are some of the concerns that we have, but we'd be happy to discuss and answer any questions that you might have afterward.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Szanowni Państwo,
Yeah.
please take the microphone because I'm sure you will need it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Szanowni Państwo, przyznają Państwo, że
Ladies
statystyki,
and
które
gentlemen, I
przedstawił
suppose you
właśnie
will
dyrektor
agree
wykonawczy
with me that the
Freemuse,
statistics that
zdają
the
się być
executive director
jednak
of
przynależeć do
Freemuse has
kategorii
just presented to us
porażających w świecie, w
are
którym
quite
technologie
alarming
cały czas
in a
popychają
world
nas do
where
przodu. Okazuje się,
technologies
że
keep
w
pushing us
kwestii
forward,
fundamentalnych praw
but then it
człowieka
turns out that
wygląda na to, że w
as
wielu
regards
państwach, które
fundamental
uchodzą za
issues pertaining to
cywilizowane,
human
mamy do
rights,
czynienia ze zjawiskiem regresji na przestrzeni
we
lat, co
often
wyraźnie pokazują
face the
statystyki
phenomenon of
przedstawione
regression
przez
over the past
Freemuse.
couple of
Drodzy
years,
Państwo,
and
mamy
the Freemuse
cały szereg
statistics
pytań, o które
have
prosiliśmy
testified to it.
wcześniej dziennikarze
Ladies and
ze
gentlemen,
względu na
there's a
charakter i
number of
dynamikę
questions
wydarzenia.
that we
Udostępniliśmy
asked
je
the journalists
wcześniej, być
to
może dotrą
make
do nas
available
jeszcze
to us
pytania w
previously.
trakcie tego briefingu.
Possibly we
Niemniej
will also
proszę
receive
pozwolić, że
additional
nawiążę do
questions
jednego z
during
pytań.
the
Mamy dwa pytania z
press
Brukseli. Nie
briefing,
dostałem
and I will
szczegółowych
now
informacji,
read
od
out
kogo dokładnie.
a few of the questions. I
Pytania
have two
brzmią w ten
questions from
sposób.
Brussels.
Jaka jest
And I will read them
opinia
out to you.
w Polsce na temat
What is the
praw
opinion
osób LGBTI
Poland
w ogóle? Czyli jakby to
on the
pytanie
rights
samo
of
w sobie w domniemaniu sugeruje,
LGBTQI persons
że
in
mamy do czynienia z
general?
silnymi stereotypami i
Well, the
raczej
question
trudnym,
in
negatywnym
itself
nastawieniem.
suggests
Tak
that
czy nie?
quite
To są
possibly
jakieś
there's a general, well, negative
Pytanie ogólne.
perception
Na
of
temat Polski w
LGBTQI
kontekście praw
rights in Poland. So
osób
the
LGBT.
question is quite general. What is the general public opinion in Poland on the LGBTQI community rights?
Myślę, że
Let me take that question.
Myślę, że jest to kwestia oczywiście pewnego rodzaju
Well, I
stereotypów, ale też
It's a matter
tego,
of
jak
certain
odbiera
stereotypes,
ten bardzo mocny konflikt kulturowy,
but it's
który mamy,
also
który obserwujemy w
about
Polsce,
the perception of the strong
Europa
cultural
i Bruksela
conflict,
w szczególności.
the perception that exists
Myślę,
in
że,
Brussels, in Europe,
bardzo trudno jest,
And I think
czytając
that it's
o
very
tym, co
difficult
się w Polsce dzieje,
when you read
często
about the
oddzielić
recent events in
informację o
Poland. It's
tym,
very difficult to
co,
distinguish between, what individual politicians do, what individual government representatives or church representatives do. So distinguishing that from the general sentiment in the Polish society might be very difficult, because the true emotions, the true sentiments that are there in the Polish society is more important, because that has been brewing for many years. And as you can see, many people decided to walk out in the streets protesting to protect the rights of the LGBTQI community. These are young people. They are part of progressive common Europe. Yes, indeed, it is quite surprising that at the time of the peak of pandemic, the largest demonstration following 1990 is a demonstration of young people protesting in favor of the LGBTQI community rights. And in fact, they enjoy a very solid support. It's a support that 70% of the Polish people declare. Right. We all know how dynamically the negative information travels. So, once you hear about LGBTQI free zones, this is an information that travels across the world immediately. So perhaps someone who's not familiar with the Polish circumstances might believe that in Poland people run around, following LGBTQ people with baseball bats. So could we elaborate on that a little more? Could we somehow shed light on the Polish specificity, on the Polish circumstances? Well, I believe that, the image that you've just painted is quite distorted, because, the old journalist truth is that, an interesting piece of news is when a person bites the dog rather than the dog bites the person. So, no one informs about dogs biting their owners, but if there's an owner that bites the dog, that piece of news travels fast. I have a feeling that a lot of concerns that are voiced are, due to the fears of the LGBTQ community that refer to the aggressive, vocal statements made by politicians. But what politicians say is not exactly reflected in this society. I've been involved in the local politics for many years now, and I've seen it change. I've seen how young people have evolved over the past years, that they are no longer afraid of revealing their sexual identity. Their sexual identity is not something that is stigmatized today. But I do remember that 30 or 40 years ago, such attitudes would be unimaginable. Well, we are all familiar with the names of inventors, artists, writers, who a few decades ago would be stigmatized, indeed. Another question from Brussels to you, Mr. Mayor. You have the expertise to answer that question. In Poland, LGBTQI-free zones, is it a phenomenon that is somehow legally sanctioned in Poland, or is it just something absurd? No, this is absolutely unacceptable. These LGBTQI zones are absolutely not legally sanctioned. It has no bearing in the Polish legislation. It is only an expression of frustration of certain circles, and the inspiration is very low. I would like to be as bold as to say that we need to remember about what happened in the 1930s in Germany. One of the best art exhibitions, I think it was 1937, one of the best art exhibitions was an exhibition of degenerate art. And that included the most outstanding works of Cubism, Fauvism, and other trends. The governments believed those were examples of degenerate art. But authors of those art exhibitions, later on turned out to be the greatest degenerates of
of the 20th century. And I suppose this is the way you need to, interpret these LGBTQI-free zones. They are a work of degenerate people and politicians. Now, can we speak of examples of artistic censorship in Poland these days, especially with reference to the LGBTQI persons? Would you say that the pandemic has introduced a new dynamic, some new variables? This is, again, a very complex question, I'd say. In a nutshell, if I am to give you a very short answer, I would say no, I haven't observed such a phenomenon. But on the other hand, there are different forms of repression. There are different forms of repression that are attempts are being made at implementing those forms of repression, but a very important element that I'd like to touch upon is the role of the Polish courts. And the Polish courts have acted accordingly. They can distinguish between, what goes beyond the boundaries of a law-respecting country. I have two more questions from journalists, and I think in a way we've touched upon these issues already. Łukasz Wojtusik from Talk FM asks, the publication of the report, what does it mean for Krakow? The publication and the announcement of the report, will long-standing cooperation entail? Well, from our point of view, it's very important. We did want this report to be published in Krakow because we believe that, against the backdrop of the often unproven, confusing information on the relationship between the public government and the artistic community and the LGBTQI community in general, I think we need to state it very firmly that Krakow is on the right side. Krakow tries not to discriminate art, not to discriminate people who are authors. So freedom, including artistic freedom and equality, irrespective of any differentiating factors, is something that is very close to our hearts as a local government. Well, 13 million tourists visit Krakow, most of them coming from abroad. Yes, and we keep inviting them to come to Krakow. We're very happy that they enjoy themselves here in Krakow. The very last question, Jakub Paduch, representing the SK Radio. What are the figures from Krakow? And I suppose this is an interesting question with a view to the imminent plans. So let me go back to the question. Will Krakow work on, hard data, statistics? Will Krakow promote the LGBTQI issues? Well, there are no local studies or analyses into the generally understood equality policy, but I am sure that we will be working on that in the coming years. There are some partial reports prepared by NGOs and co-funded by the City of Krakow. Just recently, 2 reports have been published on the subject, so I'm sure we will draw on them, but we will also be inclined to be involved in a very specific diagnosis of the situation so that the equality policy is based on hard data, hard facts, statistics. We want to know what the starting point is, and we want to know where we would like to get. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I am afraid that the time's up. We've only had 30 minutes for the press briefing, but I would like to encourage you very cordially to participate in this second part of our meeting. There will be a discussion panel, and we will elaborate on all of these issues that we only glossed over during the press briefing. Srirek, Mr. Mayor, Nina, thank you so much for participating in the press briefing, and see you in a while.
Today marks a very special date for two reasons at least. Number one, it's Human Rights Day, the day the United Nations General Assembly adopted back in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And number two, together with the City of Krakow, Freemuse is officially launching its premier pioneering report, Painting the Rainbow, How LGBTI Freedom of Artistic Expression is Denied. There are a lot of interesting case studies presented in the report, most of them painting negative, troublesome stories, but on the positive side, it reveals that even though LGBTI artists have been facing different types of discrimination in many different social, political and legal contexts, no laws, no traditions or even religions can entirely stop artistic expression around these issues. A lot of important facts, statistics and observations are very much part of our today's agenda, so let's jump right in. Please welcome the first Deputy Mayor of the City of Krakow for Social and Municipal Policy, Professor Andrzej Kulig. Welcome, Professor. The stage is yours.
Już dosyć dawno temu.
It was a long time ago, and namely on the 26th August 1789
roku.
for the first time, the people spoke and the Declaration of Human Rights was announced. And this declaration contained a number of important ideas, but two of them are really important, and we as humanity should bear that in our minds and hearts. The first one was declared that
human being is born as free, and the other that we are all equal. And it is really sad and depressing even that since that moment many things have changed. So first of all, the technology, radio, television, internet have appeared. We are able to also travel by planes, 80 days around the world. From the novel of Jules Verne became an interesting perspective, which was real, but these ideas are still being undermined. It is extremely sad because these most important ideas for humanist thought, so publicly announced by the very people in 1789, they express what is really fundamental for every living person, and this creates the foundation of a healthy society and a democratic state. The life of each and every one of us, everybody who wants to have an open approach towards others, should be guided by these two principles. And I cannot see any exceptions for it. These principles say that all people should be created equal, irrespectively of all the properties that might differ people from one another. So we should not list any types of equality with regards to any features of properties, because equality and freedom are unconditional, and the responsibility of all authorities, also city authorities, is to respect these principles. Everybody who violates these principles also violates the rights of other people and the rights of public authority to rule. That is why I'm extremely happy that Krakow is the city in which these principles are binding, in which we remember about them, and that is why we can welcome with open hearts not only the executive director of Freemuse, but also the report that shows us how we should not behave and what should not happen. And on this occasion, we can repeat once again that we deeply believe that such a report should not cover Krakow. We are sure that Krakow will never become the LGBT-free zone, will never look at art as something that is created in a right or wrong manner, that express correct or incorrect ideas, because freedom is the freedom of expression of thoughts and beliefs. Also, it is the freedom to live according to somebody's belief, and the role of the city is to create appropriate conditions to pursue somebody's freedom. That is why I would like to thank Freemuse for creating this unusual occasion to declare our policy, the policy of our city.
Mayor of the City of Krakow, Professor Andrzej Kulig, thank you so much, Professor. I'm deeply convinced that it's really important that such declarations are made today, especially on the premiere launch of Freemuse report. Next up, Maria Arena, Chair Subcommittee on Human Rights in the EU Parliament, has prepared a special address for this occasion.
Bonjour et merci de m'avoir invité aujourd'hui. Malheureusement, je ne peux pas être avec vous, mais je souhaitais partager ce message. Alors c'est vrai que la résurgence du nationalisme populiste et la montée de la rhétorique violente de l'intolérance font peser une grave menace sur la liberté d'expression artistique, tant dans les pays du Sud que du Nord. Dans les démocraties ou les dictatures, on assiste à une détérioration alarmante des droits et des libertés. Les persécutions politiques, la censure, les femmes privées de leur droit d'expression, les minorités réduites au silence, les attaques contre la communauté LGBTI constituent l'essentiel des violations recensées. Évidemment, les artistes dits engagés, femmes ou issus d'une minorité, ou bien entendu de la communauté LGBTI, vous risquez, dans le meilleur des cas, d'être discriminés et votre art d'être marginalisé, mais dans le pire des cas, d'être condamnés, torturés, voire lynchés au sens propre et figuré par une population intolérante. Oui, dans de nombreux pays du monde, l'homophobie tue. C'est le cas au Mali, par exemple, où 98% de la population pense que l'homosexuel est un mode de vie inacceptable. Gays et lesbiennes y subissent ostracisme, violence et sont menacés de mort, parfois assassinés. En Pologne, Hongrie, Bulgarie ou encore en Roumanie, la question des LGBTI est devenue un cheval de bataille des gouvernements. Dans plusieurs des États de l'Union, des alliances anti-LGBTI se sont créées entre les illibéraux, les mouvements catholiques ou les organisations d'extrême droite. Mais comme le dit Zanele Muoli, militante photographe et réalisatrice sud-africaine, dont le travail vise à éduquer les populations par son travail artistique, elle dit « Chaque personne a sa propre vie, ses propres rêves, ses propres buts à atteindre, et je ne photographie que des êtres humains, je me mets à leur place, c'est ce que nous devrions tous faire. » Loin de se poser en victime, les LGBTI se battent pour que leurs droits soient reconnus partout dans le monde, y compris dans les pays en avance sur ces questions de la société. Ainsi, victime d'une campagne de haine homophobe en ligne, le chanteur de 19 ans et porte-drapeau de la France de l'Eurovision, Bilal Hassani, a dû porter plainte devant la justice pour injures, provocation à la haine et à la violence et menaces homophobes en réponse au déluge d'insultes et de menaces reçues sur Twitter. La chanteuse Chris, ancienne Christine and the Queens, a décidé de partager sur Twitter, elle aussi, les commentaires haineux et homophobes qu'elle reçoit sur ses réseaux sociaux. Engagée pour la cause LGBTIQ, l'artiste a décidé, d'à son tour, dénoncer l'homophobie dont sont victimes certains artistes gays, lesbiens et queer, dont elle. Et cela se passe en France. Le droit international expose clairement l'interdiction de toute discrimination, y compris basée sur l'orientation sexuelle et l'identité sexuelle. Il est donc essentiel de condamner toute discrimination ou propos haineux relatifs à la communauté LGBTIQ. Les artistes sont d'autant plus la cible de ces attaques car d'une part ils sont visibles, ils font adhésion auprès des jeunes, ils sont donc perçus comme une menace par les autorités conservatrices et par les sociétés traditionnelles. Les réseaux sociaux sont à la fois pour beaucoup d'entre eux, une manière de servir leur militantisme et une plateforme pour la diffusion internationale de leur art qui fait l'objet de censure dans leur pays d'origine. Mais ces mêmes réseaux sociaux sont aussi des lieux de harcèlement et de menaces sérieuses à leur égard. Les homophobes ne peuvent se cacher derrière l'anonymat du net, ils doivent être poursuivis et nous avons besoin d'un cadre légal robuste en la matière. Je tiens encore une fois à remercier Freemuse pour ce rapport qui contribuera au débat en cours sur ces atteintes aux libertés vécues par les personnes LGBTIQ et à examiner de près sur leur présence dans les domaines culturels et sur leur vie de manière plus générale. Donc merci pour votre travail et à très bientôt.
We do indeed need powerful legal frameworks, as mentioned by Maria Arena, European Parliament's Subcommittee on Human Rights. Here in Krakow, we've been taking freedom of artistic expression for granted for centuries, but as you have heard from the statement from the Deputy Mayor of Krakow, this is something that the city now feels needs that we take a stance on. Is very important now on national level especially. Time for the long-awaited part of today's event, and that is the more detailed presentation of the report findings. Here to present it for us, please welcome again Srirak Plipad, Executive Director at Freemuse. Srirak, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all the friends and colleagues from around the world. We are very pleased to be here and launch our first LGBT and artistic freedom report in the city of Krakow. Let me first start by thanking the city of Krakow, especially at the time where Poland has turned into some challenging times in terms of their ideology itself, especially with the announcement of more than 80 local governments of the LGBT-free zone. This announcement in some local governments, it's representative of the governments. In others, they are individual authority who are in power. Regardless of the standing, we are still very concerned that this is a statement of intention of discrimination of particular peoples in the society, and it has direct effect on LGBT people and artists in the countries. And we hope that the trends will be reversed rather than continue on this path. LGBT human rights are human rights, the same human rights of everyone else. LGBT freedom of expressions are the same freedom of expressions of everyone else. These rights are guaranteed and entitled in international human rights law. And yet, in many parts of the world, as this report have shown, these rights has been limited, restricted in a very illegitimate way. The report documents violations in over 40 countries in the past 1.5 years. We analyze and identify patterns of these violations. Let me just give you, from the start, some example of the cases that we have documented from over 140 cases. What you've seen here is a picture of Mashrou Laila, as an alternative rock band from Lebanon who performed in Egypt in 2017. As a result of these performances, 75 concert goers were detained, arrested. Some received anal examinations in order to check whether there's any homosexuality and any type of LGBT. The concert itself, after the end, the Egyptian authority categorically banned all communications related to LGBT, including debate in the countries. And as a result of this, to give you one example, this is Sarah Hegazi. She went to this concert and waved these rainbow flags. She was sentenced into prison as a result of such action. In prison, she was tortured, she was sexually assaulted by inmates, and also tortured by prison authority. International organization campaigned for release of Sarah. The Canadian government accepted her as a refugee. She moved to Canada, but soon after she lived in Canada, she committed suicide, mainly because of the post-trauma syndrome that affected her. And it's just one example of how people's rights to enjoy cultural life has been limited, and they get harsh punishment by doing so. A Nigerian writer, Obi, wrote an essay called "We Are Queer, We Are Here," published in May to tackle homophobia in Nigeria. As a result, he was abducted for 3 days by unknown person. The purpose of the abduction is to promote fears, and it worked to some extent that Obi has to stop working on this very issue until he was relocated to a safe place. Julia Svetkova is another example of being prosecuted by the Russian authority on the ground of related to LGBT restriction. The ban of the work, she was also found of promoting propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations among minors. And this is one of the famous Russian propaganda law or anti-LGBT propaganda law. In Poland here, many of us have seen this picture before, the rainbow on the Virgin Mary. The LGBT who actually posted this particular picture on social media has been prosecuted for violating Article 196 of the Criminal Codes, and if she found guilty, she may be put in prison for 2 years. And there are many cases like this where artists, art and culture organization, the case is going a long distance with large scales of violations are happening. It's interesting to look at how these cases, how these violations happen in the last couple of years especially, where the trends has been growing, that the world are turning into nationalistic. The populism are growing in many parts of the world. And what particularly has made things worse for the LGBT community is that homosexuality is banned from the last centuries, largely promoted both by Sharia law and colonial legacy. Even today, there are 70 countries still criminalize homosexuality. 11 of these punished by death, and 5 countries with life imprisonment. A major agent that creating abnormalizations of LGBT movement has been the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization has been very slow to acknowledge rights and preference of LGBT and sexual orientation. The organization stopped treating homosexuality as deviation or mental disorder only in 1992. And the same organization stopped treating gender nonconformity as mental disorder just last year. And this is happening despite the UN major reforms of mainstreaming human rights into all UN systems back at the turn of the centuries. Apparently, it takes more than 2 decades before we can actually get to this point. This helped spread and create legitimacy for many governments to go after LGBT artists and arts community. This report, looking at the cases of violations from January 2018 up to June 2020 this year, over 149 acts that we managed to verify of violations. We found, for example, that 1 LGBT artist has been killed, 1 imprisoned, 22 detained, 1 prosecuted, and 5 persecuted. Other forms of violations continue in many parts of the world. It's also important to highlight that government use at least 3 category of laws. First is laws that criminalize homosexuality. In countries that have this law, we found 45% of the cases, and more number actually found in countries that criminalize homosexuality in the first place. And then the propaganda law that's been added to all of these difficulties in 35 countries. Of these propaganda laws, half of them have just been enacted recently, and recently here means 10 years. In the past 10 years, we've seen 17 countries enacting LGBT propaganda law, and this has created challenges for artists and arts community in a very large scale. When we actually look at who's responsible for all these violations of freedom of artistic expressions of LGBT artists and people, we found that over half of them responsibilities belong to the government, 16% by artistic communities and private entities. When we look at various art forms, we found that films and filmmakers has been censored and receive other forms of violations more than other art forms, followed by music and performing arts at 22% and 17% respectively. Visual arts are also being violated at a very alarming scale too. And 10 countries which already have criminalized homosexuality have introduced homosexuality propaganda laws. And we list the countries here mainly because of this law has restricted freedom of expression in a very comprehensive way, which we'll discuss and show you in a little bit more in a few minutes. When we look only the censorship part, taking out prosecution, imprisonment, and other forms, we also found that half of them happening in film industries, followed by theater and music. And this is very often you see from cutting scenes that may be related to LGBT, as well as censorship in some cases, characters. Even these characters are fictional characters. They're still being banned from that particular art forms. And we've seen almost 100 cases that happening in the past 1.5 years. All of these violations happen at the backdrop of guaranteed and entitlements of international human rights of LGBT people. Non-discrimination, equality has been the cornerstone. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantee the right of expressions of everyone, including LGBT people. And also the related rights, such as the right to association, assembly, are also being compromised. And government use a restriction of these rights without being able to justify the necessity and proportionality of the restrictions. And more often, we've seen that governments, as well as non-state government in some cases, have used a number of grounds for silencing LGBTI artists. Very first one is because those arts violate or public morals. And this is also used in bans in many countries. Simply criminal codes is sufficient to address. Secondly, LGBT artists and their artwork are being banned for violating traditional family values, while in fact such restriction has prohibited debates on what these traditional family values are really is about. Other governments use the ground of protecting children for censorship, while the UN experts has also made comments on this point that very often these grounds take away young people opportunity to learn about their sexuality and related to sexual and reproductive rights, which should be promoted and learned through this process. And the very, very traditional ones, the other two grounds that we also found in these cases has been hurting religious feelings, as we've seen the case in Poland itself. Hurting religious feeling has been made very clear under international human rights law that they cannot be used to justify restriction of freedom of expressions. The right to freedom, to religious freedom, is the right of individual. The protection is for protection of individual, not to protect ideology. The other grounds that also often used is to protect reputation of heads of state and state symbol. This is also the case for Poland, where LGBT artists were censored, removed from museum because it seems to be making fun of state symbol. And this continued to be used. Poland is one of the 13 countries that remain to have this law, while this law violates human rights principle in the first place. The committee, for example, of ministers of the EU has made it very clear that neither cultural tradition nor religious values nor the rules of dominant culture can be invoked to justify hate speech or any other form of discrimination, including on the ground of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that would sum up the challenges and the grounds that's being used against LGBTI artists and arts and culture communities. When we take a closer look into countries that criminalize homosexuality, we found that basically the law denied identity of LGBTI people in the first place. that interfere private life into their sexual relations and their activity that they like to do with. They basically tell people who to love and who not to love, who to have relationship and who not to have relationship. It very often resulted in detentions. It's allowed authority and law enforcement to do detention, release, and then detention again in order to create climate of fears. It's also, in some other places, promote violence because it's create legitimacy for violence to happen, both by government and non-state governments. And as a result, LGBT artists in particular have to face this violence in many shapes and forms. They also pose difficulties for LGBTI to register as an organization, especially when homosexuality is criminalized in the first place. They take away access of artists to cultural spaces, financial support, and when artists are relying on public funding in terms of their art projects, this has also taken away their ability to access. The permission of films in particular has been vulnerable, mostly because they need approval from related authority in order to do so. LGBTI artists in countries that criminalize homosexuality also find it very difficult to find partners to work with, whether these are government officials or other general civil society and other arts and organizations. To give you some example, in Egypt, where homosexuality is banned through the criminal code, actually, by banning under debauchery, the Supreme Council of Media regulation also categorically banned any debate and expressions related to LGBT theme. In Nigeria, with the Sharia law, especially in northern part of the country, homosexuality is punishable with death penalty. Same-sex marriage or any Same-Sex Marriage Act prescribe 10 years of imprisonment for people who publicly show same-sex amorous relationship. And these are just one example of an artist in Nigeria who basically being forced, this is the case of Malaysia, where Dennis Ho is being banned from entering Malaysia on the ground that there are a number of issues needed to be addressed if the artist is brought into the performance in the countries. That's the official government. We also see censorship, cutting scenes, denying permission of a number of films related to LGBT theme. Now take a closer look at what happened in countries where propaganda laws are being used. First of all, it exists, as I mentioned, in 35 countries, and half of this just being enacted in the past 10 years. And you will see that it's happening in countries, in Muslim majority countries, as well as in Christian majority. And in Singapore, for example, these are Buddhist majority countries. So that basically means there's nowhere safe for LGBT artists. What happened in these countries has been that the law has banned direct or indirect public shows of same-sex amorous relation. It takes away all the broadcasting and printing in the media of anything that affirmatively depict LGBTI person. So you do not see a character, any expression, any individual in this society. That's a major cleansing of LGBT from the society, public, visual, and any forms of expression at all. They also ban any health and sexuality educators from discuss LGBT topic in positive light. That basically means you cannot discuss and say things in the positive light. You can denounce, you can also say on the negative part. And also the ban include display of LGBT topic, especially when children are around. And there are many cases that LGBT artists have faced restriction under this law. The report concluded with recommendations in the end, especially we're looking at for all states who have responsibilities to protect LGBT artists, arts and culture communities in the context of the COVID-19, where artists and arts and culture communities has been affected very deeply, not only the economic because of the closure of or the cancellation of performances. We found, for example, in Freemuse, as we document this year, contrary to the common sense that during COVID-19, cases of violation of artistic freedom should be going down because of there are less shows, less performances. Reality is the opposite. Case has been increasing very sharply during this time to the level that Freemuse have to set up a separate team to monitor cases. There are at least two grounds that happen. First is government use COVID-19 as the pretext to go after distance that the government has been looking for, aiming for a longer period of time. Other has been censorship and attack artists who criticize government, especially their lockdown policy and other public health related policy. Based on these challenges that we found, we make recommendations, especially related to LGBT arts and arts community, is to review and repeal laws that violate human rights in the first place. The fact that 70 countries remain criminalize homosexuality is a law that shows discrimination in broad daylight, and this needs to stop. Including also the new propaganda law that has been increasingly being introduced. We also ask government to refrain from practicing prosecuting artists on the ground of public morals and other grounds that I mentioned earlier, as well as release prisoners who are the artists who are being imprisoned on the ground of sexual orientation and gender identity. Another group body that have a large role to play is the UN, the EU, and other intergovernmental organizations, whether this is regional bodies. The major tool government has, and the member state has been used, has been the law. And this is where the UN, EU, and other intergovernmental organizations should also take steps to urge their member states to review and repeal these laws that violates human rights in the first place. In some cases, technical assistance may be provided so that the discrimination causes in this law and the usage can be lifted. And these are some of the highlight of the report. The report is available on Freemuse website at freemuse.org. We are very excited to be able to introduce this report, and we will certainly continue to monitor freedom of artistic expressions of LGBTI people. I'll be happy to have discussions about this report and other related issues in a minute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pliepert. I wish at least some journalists, some guests could be here with us today to be able to read the physical copy of the report. It's a 120 pages booklet, very beautifully edited and designed. I can merely show you what it looks like. And the sad thing about it, Srirak, is it very much reads like a thriller in many instances. It shows a very challenging, tough reality. After all, 16 countries in 2020 when you're facing either imprisonment or death just for being homosexual. What a statistic. Mind-boggling in 2020. Thank you very much, Srirak. And I suppose now we can proceed to the next part of our program. Ladies and gentlemen, time for a special film compilation by Daniel Rycharski, Polish visual artist, graphic designer, university lecturer, author of multiple artistic installations touching on areas that have significantly gained in importance over the past few years. Daniel will be joining us during the panel discussion, which is the next item on the agenda. But first, the film. Scarecrows. This series of constructions refers directly to motifs related to the spooky legends of the countryside all sorts of strange figures and scarecrows placed in the fields to scare away wild animals. Over a dozen such frights were produced based on several different variations on the cross, a symbol that appears in a range of forms and permutations. After close to 4 months of work, these pieces were first exhibited in Kurówek, set up in the wintertime on nearby fields as an open-air installation of a functional significance. Rycharski's frights serve as an alternative archive attesting to the presence of bodies that don't fit within the narrowly defined confines of identity. Each of the items of clothing used in the project came from a specific collection or exchange with members of the LGBT+ community who have experienced some form of discrimination in their daily lives. Cut and sewn together, they create a new hybrid constellation. Then they're equipped with found objects, elements associated with some form of violence or torture. And yet these colorful constructions still hold a measure of humor and a grotesque quality as they balance the line between folk style, Calvaria, and a slightly macabre interpretation of folkloric tradition and fashion trends. These pieces are also a form of personalized fears and anxieties that loom over society. The next project is Island. The project was carried out in Jeziórka, a reservoir located in the heart of Sierpc. The artist placed a fragment of the scenography from the film Pokłosie upon the small island in the middle of the reservoir. The collection of artificial matzewots were embellished with a floral rainbow made up of the same number of flowers as there were Jewish residents in the city back in 1939. For over 3 weeks, the installation was the most visually captivating element in the city's public space, day in, day out. Each weekend, the local volunteer waterways emergency crew would take visitors by boat to give them a closer glimpse of the island. Rycharski's actions in Sierpc take their cue from one of the key cultural debates in Polish history, namely the society's relationship with their former Jewish neighbors, bringing the issue back into the current stream of debate. One interpretation of the island might consider it as a statement on the lack of tools for speaking about contemporary forms of exclusion based on class, race, or sexual orientation. Typically, this language is formulated through reference to anti-Semitism and war. By combining artificial elements together, the installation demonstrates how frames and codes can be used to seek out links between diverse experiences. Valentine's, Ash Wednesday. On February 14th, 2018, 2 distinct holidays were observed on the same day. Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday, composing an intriguing juxtaposition between a day devoted to romantic love and one dedicated to suffering. For Daniel Rycharski, this situational anecdote served as a pretext for performative activities in which he burned 2 objects that were set together, an authentic medium-sized confessional and a piece of a wall from a dark room taken from a gay club. The ash collected from both was taken, created a single grey mass and swallowed by the artist. This work represents this quintessence of activities carried out by the artist that go beyond established positions. Family care. Daniel Rycharski has artistic ties to the Sierpce region in northern Mazovia, where he has worked with local communities for over a decade. Through his practice, the artist lends his voice to LGBT+ people and contemporary forms of spirituality and religiousness. Family care, Rycharski's newest effort, is the latest in a series of projects that facilitate encounters between different social worlds. The action brought together farmers from several villages near Sierpc and a group of LGBT+ people who accompanied the locals as they went about their everyday duties. Before they save you, they must know who to save. You must be yourself, because if you're someone else, then the other one will be saved, not you. Josef Tischner. All My Fears, a film story inspired by the life and work of Daniel Rycharski. A visual artist and activist, Daniel Rychalski is engaged in artistic activities in the realm of the village. He's the creator of rural street art. In his works, he plays with stereotypes concerning the Polish province, showing current social and identity issues as well as another side of the countryside. In his works, rural identity, Christian spirituality, and queer sexual identity play an important role. He graduated from the Faculty of Art of the Pedagogical University of Krakow. In 2012, he received the title of the Culturist of the Year, awarded by Polish Radio 3. In 2016, he was awarded with the Passport of Polityka magazine in the field of visual arts. The plot, the main hero of this film is Daniel, an artist who stems from the countryside and the Catholic Church. He attempts to free himself from superficiality and from playing the roles that the world has imposed upon him. He is torn, and within this rupture lies the hero's tragic solitude. He simultaneously belongs to two opposite worlds, the Catholic Church and the LGBT community. He would like to be a bridge between them, to belong to both, and maybe even unite them. The theme of the film is also contemporary faith and the spiritual needs of young people. The character of Daniel Rychalski, a gay believer, a Catholic, strongly connected with the life of a conservative rural community, gives an opportunity to create a deeply ecumenical film about the need for dialogue. Daniel uses the language of the scriptures in order to talk about being gay and a sentient human being, a language that is natural to him. It is the overly rationalized and unspiritual language of the secular LGBT community that he is not familiar with. He does not understand them, which is one of the reasons why he takes his own cross away from the museum exhibition. The cross at the exhibition is dead to Daniel, so he sets off with it onto the streets of Warsaw. Daniel stems from the countryside and the Catholic Church. On the one hand, he tries to animate and take care of his community while enjoying its authentic respect and trust. On the other hand, he is a valued artist whose work on the rural issues is awaited by the curator of an important museum. Ladies and gentlemen, I have not been able to read the full text, but I'm sure you will be able to watch it later. Time for panel discussion, where we will hopefully have an opportunity to explore many of the issues already covered in the report and during our media briefing. And allow me to introduce our guests today. I'm joined first by Robert Piaskowski, Mayor's Plenipotentiary for Culture. Good afternoon, Robert. We have with us Maria Anna Potocka, Director of the Mozart Museum of Contemporary Art in Krakow. Good afternoon, madam. Nina Gabryś. Nina is chair of the Equal Treaty Council in Krakow. Good afternoon again, Nina. Dr. Srirak Plipat, executive director at Freemuse. And remotely, but hopefully we have the right sound quality to talk to Jacek Denel, Polish writer, poet, translator. Hello, Jacek, can you hear me? Hopefully you can hear me well.
Słyszałem, dzień dobry.
Wonderful. And last but not least, we have Daniel Rychalski. We're very much familiar with his work by now. Dzień dobry, panie Danielu, witam serdecznie. We've got so many questions, but for the purpose of a sense of equality that we are talking here today, allow me perhaps to skip all kinds of hierarchy that panel discussions are usually governed by. So perhaps I should come back to the question that we talked about with Nina. Nina, why this idea in the first place, Krakow Council for Equal Treatment? It's a very young body, it's a very young organization. What triggered it? Why do we have it?
Well, as City Equal Treatment Committee was established in 2019, and it consists on academia representatives, city representatives, activists, and people involved in city and culture life, and it was created as a beginning of equality policy in Krakow, as a beginning of a conversation, how to introduce such such policies, such strategies, which are really important, especially now and especially in Poland and on local level. So we wanted to first introduce a place of debate, a place of open dialogue between different people, different backgrounds, from different backgrounds, and create an opening for further action. That's why we focus on co-creating policies and strategies. We are writing recommendations and opinions for the president and the city. But we are also very motivated to be involved in the discussion, and that's what that is happening in public
Speaking
life.
of discussion, do you mind if I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
Krakow is a hugely international city. After all, it's visited by 13 million people, at least in the pre-pandemic period. So hopefully we'll come back to that at some point. But the question is, we've always been taking openness for granted in Krakow. But is it easy, challenging, unique in some way to implement any kind of equality policies in Krakow? Or is there anything that you would like to mention here in this context?
I think everything you've mentioned is a fact, because it's complicated and it's not easy, but it's also super important to do that, to manage this cultural heritage we have, to address it and to learn from it, because it's when I look at Krakow, I see a place co-created by so many people from different countries, ethnicities, races throughout history. We've had an amazing representatives of arts in academia, which it was people also of different sexual orientation, and that's a part of our history, of our story, and we have to, not only we are proud of it, but we have to also learn from it, and
yet the story of openness doesn't sell so well internationally as the stories of LGBT-free zones, which make people who have not been to Poland possibly think it may actually be a dangerous country to walk the streets of.
And in many times, that's actually a case. We can't pretend we don't live in a country that we live in, and we lack law that criminalizes discrimination towards LGBT persons. We lack a legal definition of hate speech in Poland. So we have those problems. But in the same time, there is an amazing a motivation in people and society to introduce a positive change. This is what we see in all of those protests. That's what we see also in the works of our artists. And we see also on local level, on the local governments. That's why it's so important that this is happening in Krakow, because for me, right now, the power to change things is on the side of the local governments. We have the power, and our strong coalition to fight for equality is the way to go.
Yeah. At the same time, even though the city has been taking these values almost for granted, still we are seeing a situation where there is a need for strong declarations, even from a city like Krakow. Thank you, Nina. We have also Marianna Potocka with us. Thank you for joining us, first of all. It's great to have you with us. Could you please hold the microphone so that everyone can hear you? It's not that LGBTI issues would be a new theme for Mozak, is it? You've been active in this area in many respects. Could you please give us a little background to start with?
Of course, we are active on each field which needs reparation. And I am big patriot, big Polish patriot, but I am very much against some Polish approaches. And in Poland, we like to have enemy, and we do not very much accept anybody and anything what doesn't look like our cliché and imagination. And we grew up in the Catholic cliché that men can love only women, women only men, and priest a child. And this is this kind of terrible Catholic approaches, and we pay for it. We pay for it with the negative position of Poland on the list of tolerance. Mm-hmm. And of course, the museum, a cultural institution, it's a kind of doctor of society approach of society health. So we have some programs connected, of course, with the problem of LGBT. And some years ago, we had the exhibition Gender in Art. It was the international exhibition of around 50 artists. And it was also a great social research, because in time of this exhibition, I used to get every day almost 3,000 emails from a Catholic association that I advertised.
3,000?
Yeah, 3,000, yeah. So I had to block the
At least address. You learned how many Catholic associations there are.
And it was against me that I advertise homosexuality, that I kill the idea of a typical Polish family. And of course, this exhibition showed me the scale of the problem. The scale of the problem, which was very deep. It is not something like a surface of thinking. It was in the heart of the people. And the next exhibition connected with the subject was the monographical exhibition of the couple, Eva and Adele. And this is, you can say, the propaganda of Christian homosexuality, because they are always very much friendly, with beautiful smile, open for everybody, ready to pose for a photography with everybody who asks them. And this is the couple which works as the artist in the form of social performance. So they appear in all the openings and important events, and also less important activity, but also for me important is production of some symbols of friendship, because we produce some gadgets with a rainbow, and if anybody wears it, it's a kind of declaration: I am a friend. I am a friend of the idea. I am the friend of the freedom of these people. And of course, we have to be open for everything, each discussion, but we have to work on changing the Polish approach to something what is obvious.
We've heard a beautiful example from the 1930s during the media briefing from the mayor, who said that things that look a certain way at a given period of time are always relative, you could say, from that metaphor. Just because some of the people watching us could be interested to take a look, I can see that both those booklets are actually almost 1 inch thick. So lots of very interesting studies must have been involved before you were able to compile and publish it. Is any of that available online that someone could refer to? Could you perhaps once again show the covers of both?
Both of them are available in our bookstore, and the bookstore is also they have also
so you can still buy them.
online selling. Yeah, and this book, this is publication not only on the art which we exposed in the exhibition, but it has also some wider text of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So we can see at least 3 very specific, very tangible examples of what has been done by Mozart Contemporary Museum of Art.
It will be one more.
All right.
But it will be the public presentation in the next year by Krzysztof Wodiczko, who works on drones projection. And these drones will have 2 screens with eyes, and we prepare the material for the presentation, for a projection with the group of LGBT people from Krakow. We have the statements, and artists will make the choice of the most, let's say, hot statements. And it will be projected in the public spaces in few places in Krakow next year.
Thank you very much, Maria. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you don't mind if we go to Jacek and Daniel for a while. Jacek, you're talking to us directly from Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. You're a well-known translator and poet, and I think it would be very interesting for our audience to touch on the issue of censorship as you have known it over the years and experienced it over the years. We're dealing with a situation where, well, there are obviously 2 kinds of censorship. One would be the obvious, visible to everyone kind of censorship, and the other would be the softer, pressure-driven types of censorship linked to funding, linked to the link between culture and public funding. Could you make a few comments on that? Can we talk about an unprecedented period of soft censorship, whether we call it soft or not is a separate question, after 1989? We have not seen anything like it. Is it fair to say, or is it an exaggeration?
So obviously we don't have a state project of censorship, preventive censorship, that would stop people from publishing their books or poems or whatever. But we do have soft censorship, and as you said, a large part of it is the whole system of blocking initiatives, stopping the financing of literary magazines, for instance. So in recent years, you can see that the literary magazines that are fueled by public money are mostly going to, or almost exclusively to, right-wing and religious magazines, whereas all the left-leaning or even central magazines, or magazines that did not have any political purpose, were cut off from the public financing. And we can also see how the Polish Book Institute, which is a state agenda working for the promotion of literature abroad, has moved its interest from all kinds of literature, including LGBT authors, to sort of religious stance, right-wing. They are promoting books of right-wing journalists. They are promoting books about saints of the Catholic Church. And I think for like 3 last years, those magazines, new books from Poland that are published once or twice a year, are not featuring LGBT authors. I know that there were some attempts of getting a financing of translations for the LGBT literature that were also denied because the Polish Book Institute is also financing some of the translations of Polish literature. But after all, I must say that writers are in a rather privileged situation. So as long as you don't have a central system of censorship, this is just you as writer, there is your publisher, and there are your readers. And of course you do have state media, and they are choosing what they promote very carefully. So you're underprivileged a little.
Jacek, could I stop you there for a while? You mentioned something.
Theater where the public spending is very important, and you cannot really sustain yourself without public funding. Lots of people are surviving thanks to the local communities, the government of the cities, which are often in that position. However, when it comes to the central financing, the state financing, it's very difficult for any artists who are not right-wing thinking or who would like to make any kind of LGBT-related projects. From what I hear from people.
Jacek, can you hear me? It looks like you can't hear me, much as I would love to ask you another question.
Yes, I do.
You can hear me, wonderful. You mentioned making careful choices. So if we talk about censorship at a more subtle level, are we talking about self-censorship in anticipation of possibly the kind of trouble you can expect if...
I guess many people do. So some just work in projects, are submitting projects which are attractive to the government and are just working on their own projects separately. Some are just choosing some kind of emigration, either remaining in the country, but immigrating to their own state or immigrating abroad. There are also authors who are just thriving again, and they are working for this new project of a man. I guess there are some writers who bend a little, and there are those who don't. It's always a question of choice.
Thank you.
For instance, I can say what has changed in my life. I have stopped writing any recommendations for scholarship, given the state because I think it's that.
Jacek,
when it comes to scholarships given
Jacek,
by the city, I'm willing to count. Yes.
Yes, the sound quality has been consistently deteriorating over the last few seconds. So let us hope it's not yet another example of censorship between Krakow and Berlin. Thank you very much, Jacek. For now, can we go to Daniel for a moment? Panie Danielu, witam serdecznie, miło pana zobaczyć na żywo. Czy słyszymy się?
It's good to see you live. Can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you very well.
Tuż przed pandemią miał pan okazję zorganizować swoją pierwszą wystawę we Francji, gdzie spędził pan pół roku, prawda? I pamiętam, że w naszej rozmowie, w naszej wczorajszej rozmowie rozpoczął pan takim zdaniem, że dopiero gdy zobaczyłem Polskę z zewnątrz, ja wstawię tutaj trzy kropki i poproszę pana o dokończenie.
Please continue. What did you say?
Dopiero tak naprawdę to był mój pierwszy dłuższy wyjazd za granicę i tak naprawdę to była moja pierwsza okazja, żeby zrobić jakieś działanie, postawę
to carry out
any
actions, any projects outside Poland.
And what I took from my stay in France was that they realized that Poland, that I'm perceiving Poland from a different angle. I realized what was missing and what was in excess and what our greatest problem was. And the thing that I took from my zacząłem myśleć o takim projekcie, który łączyłby znowu te zwaśnione plemiona w Polsce. Zauważyłem, że największym problemem jest to, że jesteśmy bardzo podzieleni. I pomyślałem, że byłem też trochę zmęczony lazurowym wybrzeżem, południem Francji, chciałem wrócić do siebie, do Kurówka na wieś. I chciałem zrobić projekt.
Byłem zmęczony południem Francji, brzmi jak oksymoron prawie, prawda? Dla wielu. Ale proszę mi powiedzieć, faktycznie te linie podziału, mówimy o tym właściwie na każdej możliwej dyskusji, na każdy możliwy temat, na każdej możliwej konferencji w Polsce. W pana odczuciu, jako osoby, która na tle dyskusji, w kontekście międzynarodowego raportu, o którym dzisiaj rozmawiamy, pana perspektywa
context of an international report is a kind of unique. Your perspective is unique because you see how the generalized actions affect local community. So I quickly realized that the change will not come from the state, from school, from the church. To be honest, in fact, is that we should begin with grassroots actions. Certainly, I respect what the local artists do. I really respect it in rural and urban areas. So this is perhaps not very attractive, but I believe that there is a lot of work that needs to be done in the province. This will not be done by the state, by the church, by the school. We can do it. Artists can do it. So it sounded like positivist philosophy, but in today's reality, we should rather hope that this should be both top-down and grassroots. But I'm thinking of you in the categories of healing, verbatim, healing Polish society. How do you understand it? Yes, this was immediately after I returned from France. I returned to the countryside and I wanted to connect two separate communities. On the one hand, I realized that this group is traditional family in crisis, and the other group, LGBT plus people who are persecuted now, and they are also in crisis. And I wanted to make a project in which the two groups could help each other. And Tomasz Rakowski from the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology brought me a book written by Andrzej, Family Care, which talks about the forgotten psychiatric tradition in Chorów in Białystok. So where patients who are chronically sick were given for care to rural families, and the hospital paid these families, releasing the patients from the confinement of a mental hospital. And I can say that, well, I'm not trying to compare the LGBT people to mental disorders, but I can say that we as the society are sick. We are sick, suffering from homophobia. And I can say that those who are affected, that is Polish farmers, should treat us from this homophobia. So this is an important contribution here, but what seems to be very important from my own personal perspective is that you mentioned the issue that we addressed during this debate, which is very intimate and refers to the community of your origin, and you return to it from the south of France. So I believe that at the times when we start talking that for LGBT milieux, it's quite difficult to feel at home in Poland. Many people say where to escape and how. You are the person that, in spite of the difficulties, you are very sentimental and nostalgic about the return to your local community, although the subjects that you address are quite difficult to comprehend and accommodate in Polish reality. I cannot hide that Polish LGBT people really find it difficult in Polish province. The majority of them immigrated to larger cities where they have better living conditions, and those who stayed in rural areas have a very difficult life. I made a project a few years ago about it. The title was Cross,
cross, and it was presented in Ujazdowski Castle, where I found a story in the south of Poland where the situation is the most difficult for LGBT people. I know that there were people who committed suicide, so it was because of homophobia and the persecution. I cut the tree on which those people hanged themselves, and I took it to Warsaw, where there was a cross close to the Ujazdowski Castle, and this cross discussing the national tragedy as Smolensk in 2010, and I wanted to replace this cross with a different one, which illustrates the national tragedy, that is our homophobia. So I can remember also a very worrying case of a man who burned himself just in front of the Palace of Science and Culture, exactly where you placed your cross. So also it was a sign of protest, but this great tragedy as well. But also it was written in the sense of oppression. Yes, absolutely. A few years ago, in 2015, when I was closely collaborating in rural solidarity, when they learned that I'm a visual artist, they asked me to design a banner for them for the new patron. And this was to be Andrzej Filipiak, who in 2013, he also burned himself. He covered himself with petrol and burned himself as a protest against poverty and persecution. And I made this banner, but two versions of it. So one of them was made as the faith and rainbow, and the other one was for traditional farmers. So I wanted to connect in this unconventional way these two groups. Daniel, thank you. And now we will return to our studio.
Listening to those perspectives, you have a number of fresh ideas and thoughts. But looking at what's revealed in the report, what do you feel, having watched how the situation in Poland is evolving? What could the LGBTI community in this special area of artistic expression learn from the report and perhaps spread it wider?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it is important to see Poland as a part of the larger international community. The world is increasingly interconnected. What we see, say, the LGBT-free zones challenges in Poland is the tips of iceberg, I would say, of what is underlying beneath, and that's divisions in the countries. And that's including a sense of discrimination, a sense of us and them that might be happening in different shapes and forms. When a minister says something against LGBT community, we have to see it as not only one person. It is the communities, it's the politicians, it is because this narrative sells in Poland. That's why the politicians speak it out that way, because you speak to the supporters. So the very first point I'd like to make is how Poland is interconnected. But this interconnectedness also shows that we are now living in the world where there's growth of nationalism and populism. Research also shows that political parties in powers are now shifting toward the right, economically as well as in terms of the political and liberalization. The political party in the left are now struggling generally more when compared. And if you look at the other point to really make is public perception as well leading to the behaviors can be manipulated. Now, we are living in the world of social media, and I guess a classic example is in America, where you see over 70,000 people voted for Trump, for example.
70 million, yeah.
Almost, or close to 70 million people voted for Trump. That basically means narrative, when you keep speaking to your particular audience, you can also create very divided society. The announcement of LGBT-free zone in 80 local governments and regions in Poland has to be seen in that light. You have to see, is the trend increasing, decreasing, not just a static picture.
And understand the tools that impact this trend, because after all, the sad truth of what the report reveals also seems to be that even though we all have access to those social media and endless number of news outlets, we are still impacted by indoctrination and propaganda and spinning stories that turn the tide in one direction or another.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is where it is very important for the report launch to be happening in Krakow, because what we need is also the narrative, the discourses. This is a fighting between discourses, between the part that say LGBT are different, we should get rid of them, we should really silence them. Then you force LGBT people to go underground. Their art, their culture, limited their access to funding, to the opportunity to showcase their work. And then the other narrative that have to come in and take even more. It's a fighting of discourses, and we see. And in America, in Poland, in many parts of the world. But the worrying trend is the narrative of us and them seems to be winning in many battles. And we certainly hope that we can actually save the battles in Poland here.
We've heard from Marii, chair of the European Parliament Subcommittee on Human Rights, saying that legal frameworks governing these areas need to become much stronger. At the same time, we have the head of the European Commission in the State of the Union address addressing this issue of LGBT-free zones in Poland, which, as has been confirmed a number of times here, are essentially illegal absurdities. What should be done so that we travel the road from policy to practice? Because 16 countries worldwide where it's either death or imprisonment just for being homosexual. I mean, what is that in 2020?
A short answer is to enforce rules of law. And I think that's where the major problems that happen, say, in Poland, in Hungary, and also other countries, not only these two countries. The overall weakening of rules of law in Europe context, for example, has been happening at a very alarming level. Our research also shows that a number of censorship generally that happening has been growing very quickly in Europe and North America. And that changed the perception that censorship happening in poor countries, in developing countries, in the global south. No, actually, the North violates artists' rights of minority backgrounds more than those in the global south. So coming back to the EU certainly have to step up and using all the mechanism. I understand that's reluctant in Brussels to actually put or push boundary on their member states.
It's difficult enough to push through financial governance unity, as we know, because of the current EU summit as we speak now in Brussels.
Absolutely. I think this is where the key battlegrounds, whether you tied up rules of law with the budget approval, that's actually one important battle.
That should be easier, right?
Yes, actually, but that's one front. There's many other mechanisms that also, in terms of supporting smaller projects and programs level, that you need to bring rules of law and tied it up also with the terms of equality and non-discrimination, the inclusions of participants in those European-wide projects, especially when it comes to arts and culture. That have to be made very clear that the inclusion will be important. And this will be harder for Hungary and Poland to do a veto voting, for example, because there are certain platforms and decision-making process where national governments can veto. There are other platforms that are more conducive also for the European Parliament to use a mechanism to actually enforce rules of law as well as non-discrimination principle and turn that policy into practice by pushing in all fronts. I think that would be the steps for the EU to take.
So given your experience of, if I remember correctly, about 10 years in Amnesty International, you have a unique perspective on these issues. Again, your stance is that the legal position of the EU should be much stronger in implementing measures linked to human rights?
The legal framework itself certainly can be strengthened. The law that exists is sufficient. It is a matter of implementing the law in the EU context. So we are not asking for additional law, new law.
Precisely.
We are asking for implementing the current laws. Europe
After all, the WHO, as we have seen in the presentations, declared it is not a mental disorder back in 1992. So there are enough laws as such, but we are still somewhere in the void of being unable to explain it to people. Is that the case?
Certainly. I think this is one of the impact of the movement of LGBT community itself. There's been many progress, and I think it's important to acknowledge some of the work by LGBT communities. Every year, there are increasing the number of countries that acknowledge and legalize same-sex marriage, for example, and other progress that has been made on various LGBT fronts. But when it comes to some particular areas like freedom of expression, the propaganda laws, as well as when it comes to LGBT and science, with WTO, for example, that's a very slow learning curve if you put it in a broader framework, they acknowledge. And that has been used. And again, we talk in the context of populism, social media, and manipulation that can be done at multiple levels. This is very dangerous time indeed when you actually act very slowly. And if I can add one point, and that's the importance of LGBT community to actually come and work together on various fronts. Certainly progress has been made in terms of acknowledging the right to work of LGBT people and other fronts when you look at all of the human rights spectrum related to LGBT people. Freedom of expression has been one of the difficult ones. And actually, for LGBT people, freedom of expression comes very close to who they are as a person. Because if they can't say, this is me, this is my identity, when you can't say who you are to the public, you lose a large part of your humanity itself.
It is ironic, because if you look at countries such as, for instance, the United States of America, freedom of artistic expression for LGBTI persons is one thing, but at the same time, you see how much other freedom of expression you get if you only watch political satire, of which they have like dozens of excellent political satires, poking fun at just about everyone in a fashion that by European standards would still be considered extreme. So are there significant differences? Because from your report, Srirak, one of the most fascinating things about the case studies you're presenting is that we're seeing very interesting trends in countries like India and China, in the positive sense also of the word. In the past, when these things were really facing hardline reactions, now increasingly a blind eye is turned. There is no official tolerance often, there is no official acceptance, but from different boards and government organizations, there is, it seems to me, more tolerance than in the past in countries like China.
I think this is a bit hard to say that there's more tolerance. I think overall increasing intolerance has been happening, and the forms. And I think one interesting aspect of it is, this is one of the reports, Freemuse, that it's been hard to use number of cases to explain what actually happened to LGBT artists and arts and culture. Because in countries that categorically ban LGBT arts, then you don't even case of censorship because people stop working on it. People do not have funds to work or art gallery to show their work or films and movies because there's no work being done, or you have to go underground or go abroad. Other option is being killed and being imprisoned. But then that's the part where the case doesn't justify it, and which is why I also highlight the law, the legal framework that make it very difficult for artists. It creates environment. And I think it's important to point out also that art, culture, creativity, for them to grow, you need to create a good enabling environment. It's just like you plant a tree in a very harsh, hostile environment, tree don't grow. And the same with creativity, you need to have a proper environment for this to grow.
Speaking of environment, your next step seems to be creating an LGBTI action network for artistic freedom. Could you elaborate on that? What do you exactly mean by that?
Yes, this is where we invite LGBT artists and arts and organizations working in the field of LGBT-related theme to come together and work together to share experience, connect. The very idea is to connect grassroots. I think our colleague just mentioned about where's the starting point. You basically have to start where you can in practice. This is the network to connect grassroots at the national level with international level and provide that bridge for us to be able to exchange views. And I know I'm going to be speaking about the Global Action Network in a few minutes.
Exactly. Yeah. But before that, Svirak, thank you very much for this statement. You actually reminded me of my fascinating short, albeit short, conversation with Marii Potocka yesterday when we talked about treating the patient, the ultra-conservative mind. How do we do that, Maria? Tell us. I mean, we are facing...
Of course, it was a free-going conversation, so I used maybe a bit different phrases than normally I do. But, of course, I consider cultural institution as a kind of a social mental medicine institution. We have to change the approaches, we have to change the thinking, we have to give everybody the field for freedom and free expression. And of course, such an obligation is mainly concentrating on something what is problematic on the field of freedom. And now, because for many years we had this problem with women expression, with women art, with female art. Now it is the problem with the subject. I am not very keen with the phrase LGBT artists. Because I do not want to make something like a separate field of somebody's creation.
Labeling
we
someone
have all.
From the outset.
Unfortunately, I am not homosexual. I would love to be, but it's my problem. But I feel obliged to fight for the freedom of these people and to, let's say, to erase the word. Because when we will get to the position that nobody will be against, that the freedom will be something like a natural gift, the word will disappear. And this is our target. So I do not like this segregation, LGBT artists on other artists. We are all LGBT. We are all Jews. This is something like an obligation.
Maria,
sorry for the manifesto.
It's a great manifesto, thank you for that. And to be fair, to be perfectly honest with you, gender in art will be probably the very first thing I read after this panel discussion. Hopefully I can still find it in your shop. Next up, so Robert, Maria mentioned that the goal here is to change the thinking. I was almost tempted to ask Maria on a scale of 0 to 10, in 10 years from now, how likely is it that the thinking will change?
15 years ago, when I used to be the director of Bunkier Sztuki in Krakow, we declared that our institution is going to open the march of homosexual, let's say, march. It's a different name in Poland. And I was invited by the deputy mayor of Krakow, and he was very much against. It was 15 years ago. And now I am extremely proud of the city that we participate in this panel.
And we're talking about the same mayor.
15 years. How much changed?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's very important, the role of public institutions in defending human rights in general, defending LGBT community rights, but also giving open frames, open environment, because this is exactly what we believe city is. City is a mosaic of identities, and we need to give them space, give them voice in many ways. And art is one of those ways. And I believe that Krakow is a part of human rights cities in this global sense of cities. They believe and they express themselves through intercultural diversity, through rights to express, to give a voice to all those people that are silenced in different contexts. And Masha is a great example of one of the institutions giving a very consequent and well-documented path over the last decades, showing LGBT art, presenting from public sources. It's public finance institution. It's very important to mention. But also tonight we have at Divine Comedy Festival, Polish premiere of Eribon Didier book, play, Return to Reims, homosexual novel adapted to the play, and it's a very important part of this festival. And I think festivals here in Krakow has been always fabric and a locomotive of a change. I remember Unsound Festival, gay-friendly concerts under the rainbow flags 10 years ago or even more. Sacrum Profanum presenting LGBT transsexual artists also, giving them voice. Conrad Festival inviting LGBT writers, giving them voice for this testimony, to give them to give a voice to different perspectives, and so many different institutions. Recently, this building, ICE Congress Hall, has been illuminated in rainbow flag colors, even if there were some fears. This temptation to self-censorship, how it will be...
Because potentially there can be some risks for a public institution to do something like that.
Cities or institutions will lose, especially state subventions, fundings. So it's important to mention and underline that in 80% Polish culture is subventioned by cities. And this is extremely important role of municipalities to provide this shelter where let's say nations policies are more reluctant or more hostile, or they create some forms of exclusions, how it happened in Poland in many little rural regions. Sirak mentioned LGBT-free zones, but also in official quotes, but by even president of this country. It's very unfortunate what I'm saying, but it's true.
Robert, I have a number of questions in the tough category for you. The fact alone that Sirak is here with us and that the Freemuse report is launched from Krakow is reason enough to say that in comparative terms, Krakow is indeed an open city. But the first quick tough question for you, Robert, is it in any way, let's dispel those stereotypes and fears. Is it in any way dangerous for an LGBT person to walk about the streets of Krakow all day long, dressed in a rainbow flag, just walking about town, whether it's during the day or in the evening? Is it in any way dangerous, and has anything changed in that respect over the past years?
I think it's even a new form of expression of cities' inhabitants to dress up with rainbow flags
and symbols, not necessarily
jackets or bags or socks.
Badges.
Or badges. But it's actually, I think this is the very last exhale of populism, homophobia, and misogyny in our towns, because on the street you have seen completely different answer. People fighting for women's rights over last weeks in Poland, having also rainbow flags, because it's a momentum where we all claim basic rights for everyone, basic rights to be different, to express in your own way. And I really enjoyed the quote from Daniel's movie, the quote of a priest, actually. I don't remember the sense, but I found the same quote from Angolan artist from South African, Zanele Muholi. She said, if I wait for someone else to validate my existence, it will mean that I'm shortchanging myself. She said in African states. So it's such a beautiful connection between your movie, Daniel, and what I found on Freemuse website a few days ago. Yes, I think that it's important to stress that the future belongs to the cities. They will declare as a cities, they are open for everyone, because this is actually identity of contemporary cities. If those cities are not tolerant, attractive talents of different identities.
Fair enough. Is it safe? Is it safer or is it less safe to walk the streets of the city for LGBTI persons today?
In my opinion, it's safe.
It's safe.
But you can find also, we have radical accidents even in Paris. Remind the teacher who was teaching about tolerance a few weeks ago and how it happened.
Robert, frankly, when you mentioned people fighting for women's rights, I immediately noticed that Nina grabbed her microphone and she wanted to say, I'm making a comment on this. Nina.
I would say that we're in a special moment. I believe we are on the verge of change, and a positive one. But
good, you added that part.
Yeah, but this is. But before that change, we experience.
And it will take less than a century. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I hope we are looking in the perspective in a couple of years, but. We have to be aware that our feeling of safety and security inside of the city is very different from the experience of people from smaller cities and villages all over Poland. There are many people experiencing discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and we have to address it. Like we cannot go around it and pretend it's okay, because we have to be honest with each other. We are living in a country when president says openly homophobic things, and that's somehow okay. In most European countries, that kind of phrases would be considered disqualifying for political representative, and it's acceptable. And to add to that, it's very harmful because it builds up an acceptance inside of the society that those kind of homophobic phrases are considered appropriate narrative. It's just homophobia became one of the opinions, and this is a situation we cannot allow, and we have to stand up for very, very strongly.
And are we seeing pragmatism of this kind and conformism? Because what you're saying essentially is that if you play the cards that sort of look well in the government representative's portfolio, you're likely to be treated much better. Is that what you're saying at the same time?
Yes, but what I'm saying is it's very important to hear also the community and what they are saying, because the vision of the institutions are sometimes very different from the people, from the actual people and members of LGBT community, and their experience are very diverse. It's very different city to city and place to place. And
very good you say that. Please finish.
Because I think we are living in a very dangerous but interesting times, because I think this is the moment. It is an occasion that Poland goes to the left side, and for good. But it's going to take some time, and it's certainly not going to be easy. It's going to be harmful and very painful in moments because it is. We see that on the streets. It's happening right now, this cultural war. But I hope, and I think we all have to hope that we are going to win it.
There is a clear expectation in all of your voices that some kind of shift is hanging in the air. Robert, I'm sure you would. I have the toughest question left for you for the end of this panel, and we are running out of time. But are we? Because there are lots of ironies in the situation in Poland. For instance, even though we're so right-wing, it's the time where the Catholic Church is paying the highest price and is likely to pay the highest price of all these political forces in Poland for what is happening now in Poland. It is an irony, isn't it? But do you expect a massive shift within a shorter period than 10 years? What kind of time frame are we talking about? There is a lot of wishful thinking, hopeful voices here, but what kind of time frame are we talking about? What kind of catalysts are needed?
We need a revolution, and those are happening fast.
Thank you, Nina. Robert, before the final question of the day.
I thought that was the toughest question, because it's a very difficult question, and I think that religion which excludes someone is not religion. That's ideology. Mm-hmm. That's the true ideology. That's something to stress. I wanted to say that we are in very comfortable situation. We are in the European city, open city, shelter city, icon city, city providing public money to express all of the voices. We are speaking in municipal environment. Mayor is introducing in response to president of the state. Our mayor is saying, gay, lesbians, you are always welcome. So it's a beautiful word. What we can say about African, Arabic states, Russian, that's the challenge to all of us. And so we feel this duty that changing the situation and minds here in Poland, we can also changing the world. And this is such extremely important, Syriac, that you decided to come here, because such a decision gives us more power. It inspires us to be more connected, to do not only treat LGBTQI rights only from, let's say, a legal point of view. It's much more. It's much more. It's something more basic. And I'm very grateful that Daniel is here, because what he said is important. That should be new perspective for also public cultural institutions, that they cannot be monadic world, living in their bubbles. They need to connect with region, with rural environment. And we aspire to be regarded as cities like Berlin, where Daniel is, where Jacek is. And Jacek is a very strong voice for not only for LGBT community, but also for human rights. And this is important to hear those voices. So we will always give the frames for that. Tonight, I mentioned the Divine Comedy Festival, but tonight, in that city, we will give an award also of Sergio de Mello, High Commissioner of United Nations for Human Rights, to 3 important people. One is the guy protecting minorities, Christians minority in Iran, so Association Wiesna from Belarusia, but the most important honorary award will be given to Marian Turski, the Auschwitz survivor, who recently said that Auschwitz haven't fallen down from heaven. It starts from LGBT-free zones. It starts from exclusion. So it's an important message we would like to address also in this special day to the world.
You're making it so much more difficult with this inspirational statement, which would be a perfect closing for our panel. But I'm still going to ask you the tough question, because I promised it. And the question is, let's make a reference to Orwell asking this question, because it feels like there is a hierarchy of cities in Poland where LGBT persons are feeling more equal or less equal on an everyday basis depending on where they are. Is it a fair statement to make that we've talked about the Berlin-Krakow bridge today, we've covered the countryside perspective on the issues we're talking about, but if we look at Poland as a whole, especially big cities, is there a hierarchy? In other words, if you're an LGBTI person in Poland, choosing a city to live in,
I think there is no moment for competition in such things. This is the moment of co-opetition and, I mean, collaboration, creating networks, encouraging each other. And I think that it happened in Poland already. Gdańsk, Warsaw, Poznań, Krakow, Wrocław, all those cities united in expression of LGBT-friendly values already. Mm-hmm. But what is especially moving to me is to see small towns. Mm-hmm. For example, my nephew, he is open gay, and he's 16 years old, mm-hmm. and he's fighting for his own rights in very small town, 5,000 people only.
Yeah. It's like the case from Jordanov that
Daniel same here, and that's extremely important. Mm-hmm. If you make this testimony every day, and I think what is important that cities are encouraging each other. For example, Krakow was the very first in ICORN, International Cities of Refuge, and actually thanks to International Cities of Refuge, which is a partner organization for Freemuse, we've got this invitation from Syriac, so we are very grateful for this. So it's an organization providing shelters to persecuted writers, also gay and lesbian.
Yes.
And from Krakow, we have now Gdańsk, Wrocław, and Katowice in the network, and Warsaw is joining soon. So it's amazing that we can create strong networks through such simple things, providing residencies to persecuted writers. It's important.
Thank you very, very much, Robert. I think it's only fair, we've run out of time for this panel discussion, but it's only fair that we go to Berlin for the last one or two sentences of commentary in closing of this discussion. Jacek, having listened to us talking about the different aspects in the context of the Freemuse report, is there a single sentence as a poet, as a writer, that you would like to close this debate with before I say my last words? That's a surprise question, I know. Give it a try. From Berlin, no less.
Podziwiam Państwa optymizm.
I really respect your optimism.
Thank you very much, Jacek. It says a lot. Robert, you would like to add one more thing?
So yeah, Jacek, if I may, because I found something really interesting. The quote, "I am proud that I found the courage to deal the initial blow to the hydra of public contempt." And that was the words by Karl Heinrich Ulrichs in 19th century. Probably that was the very first gay man to publicly announce his sexual identity in Germany in 19th century. If I would not say this in the 19th century, that would be also a beautiful message to all of us. We need to blow to the hydra of a public contempt. So let's do it.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's only proper after what Robert has just said that we close with what we saw in Daniel's film, that is the quote from Józef Tischner: "Before they save you, they must know who to save. You must be yourself, because if you're someone else, then the other one will be saved, not you." Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for attending our panel discussion. We'll now need 3 minutes of intermission to rearrange the stage for the artistic part of the program, and I certainly encourage you to stay with us for this wonderfully symbolic moment of the day. Thank you once more. Welcome back. Dr. Srirak Plipat will now introduce the LGBTI Action Network for Artistic Freedom. Welcome back, Srirak. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. We have enjoyed the conversation at the panelists' discussions. We have also seen some of the highlights of the report. Certainly the report has discussed a number of challenges we are facing. The big question for us is certainly, so what's the solution? We've seen all the challenges that are happening around the world, the shrinking space of arts and culture, especially for those minority in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity included. A proposal that we put forward to all of our friends and colleagues around the world is for us to explore how an LGBTI action network can be developed, create, and help contribute to positive change, how we can turn this and offer solution. Now, if you look at what's the very purpose of this LGBT action network, the main purpose is to create and develop space and platforms for LGBTI artists and arts and culture organizations to be able to enjoy, be able to express, exercise their rights to free expression in a very safe, without fear of persecution. We're also looking at some particular purposes of how this can be facilitated. So we invite all artists, everyone who work in arts and culture communities to come together, send a message to us, and we would like very much to explore what we can do. Let me just highlight some of the 4 purposes that we think the LGBTI Action Network for Artistic Freedom can do. Very first one is to defend and to protect LGBTI artists at risk. This is basically to provide emergency funds for them. When they are being prosecuted, we will help provide legal advice when we can. If we cannot, we can also provide financial aid so that they can actually get lawyers, especially in situations where they are not sufficiently legally represented. So that's the very first step. When they are imprisoned, we will campaign, we will challenge and call for release of LGBTI artists who are imprisoned simply because they exercise their human rights. That's the very first purpose, is to defend and to promote artists at risk. Oh, and also when artists at risk needs to be relocated from countries that put them at risk, then we will provide safe space for them, very usual in another country, so they can continue to do the work that they have been doing. Secondly, the purpose of the LGBTI Action Network is to strengthen enabling environment. And this is basically to challenge laws and policy that violates human rights in the first place. We believe that art work and cultural work need to have a proper environment for it to grow. Creativity can grow in places where creativity are enabling to grow. There's too many laws and policy that still violates human rights, and we would challenge this law. We'll campaign together to repeal, to amend clauses that explicitly discriminate artists from exercising their rights, especially for LGBT artists. We will certainly promote activism. That's the very third purpose. So artists from around the world, LGBT or not, can generate activism in their countries, doing film festival, organize music festival, organize seminar, running campaign, doing art exhibition, anything of their creativity, or in essence, using arts and culture to promote social change, making those small changes that happened around the world and inspire others. The growth of activism will be very important. So we don't only be victims of violations, we can also be social change agents, and that's what we're aiming for. And finally, the very purpose of our action network is to create community of practice so that artists from around the world can come and share their experience. They can discuss if there are particular piece of work that could do together in order to promote better environment and support artists at risk, they can do that. So these are the broad strategic framework as well as purposes that we're looking at. We also have made the case that we're putting together a program after this report. So if you are donors watching this now, you're invited to join us, whether to support financial and other technical support, we very much welcome. If you are artists listening to this, send us a message. Go to our website, freemuse.org. Send us a message what you can do, what you would like to do, and how we can actually work together to contribute and provide solutions to these challenges that we are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srirak Plipat, Executive Director at Freemuse. It is only proper that at an event dedicated to the freedom of artistic expression, we should actually have artistic expression, which brings me to perhaps the most symbolic part of our today's event. Please welcome Kaja Ciosek, Freemuse Communications Officer, who will read the poem The Way They Were by LGBT Poet Laureate Trudy Howson. Kaja, join us.
There is danger in dark places. For men like us, there are no spaces where we can be proud, where we can be free, where I can love you and you can love me. We know how great the risk would be. We'd be ostracized by society. Our lives and careers would be ruined, of course, by blackmail, prosecution threats, or force. Because of that, we play the game of love that dare not speak its name. My problem is, when I hear your voice, my spirit doth lift, and my heart rejoice. My flesh is weak, but my spirit strong. I know in my heart it is not wrong for men to love men and boy to love boy, to share love and respect, happiness and joy.
Thank you very much, Kaja. I suppose we've talked a lot today about shifts in perspectives and what needs to change in the future. So for now, we will literally shift perspective from this narrow, zoomed image to a wider picture to reveal the artists who are joining us today. The one and only Agata Kulig, who needs no introductions, by the way, in Poland. She's joined by Konrad Ligas. Our stage is gracefully yours.
Your eyes, your smile, the way you move through your day in your own special way lets me know that I have everything that I need. In you, you're my heart's desire. I never ever felt like this before. With a love that makes me feel so secure. And the way that you kiss and hug me, I'm sure your loving makes me want more and more. So come a little closer to me, so you can see how it feels when two hearts are beating as one. Just a little closer to me. You know that time will stand still in the magical thrill of our love. The tears that I cried when you're holding me close and we're making sweet, sweet love through the night. Deep inside love's yearning, passion's fire is burning, and I never ever felt like this before. With a love that makes me feel so secure. And I promise you to love you whenever I'm all the woman you're praying for. Come a little closer to me so you can see how it feels when two hearts are beating as one. Just a little closer to me. You know that time will stand still and the magical thrill. Come a little closer to me so you can see how it feels. Yes, just a little closer. You know that time will stand still in the magical thrill of our love. 10,000 lifetimes I wanna spend with you. Once in a lifetime, this dream like this comes true. Yes, the hand of fate has taken us to its blessed time. You're the rhythm of my life, the sweet melody in rhyme. Just a little closer. Oh, yeah. Come a little closer to me so you can see how it feels. Yes, just a little closer. Yes, you know the time will stand still in the magical thrill of our
Thank you so much, Agata, Konrad. Thank you. Stay with us for the final of the day. Now, Ms. Emily Dalterio, Communications Manager at Freemuse, will read the declaration for the LGBTI Network for Artistic Freedom, outlining its core mission and values. Emily, join me.
LGBTI rights are human rights. Freedom of expression for LGBTI people is freedom of expression for all humanity. We will light up the darkness which hides injustice and nurtures cruelty with our community of hope. We will not be silenced. We will challenge rules that discriminate, policy that excludes, and practice that divides. We will end impunity of violence from fear, of expression from hatred. We will not be silenced. Take action, for only action will bring about change. Be a part of our community, the LGBTI Action Network for Artistic Freedom.
Thank you very much, Emily. We have almost reached the end of today's event. Let me express a hope that the time will come soon when all of us will be able to meet here physically at ICE Krakow Congress Centre, a place which is known for organizing fantastic concerts, conferences, congresses. And for the symbolic closing of today's special event, once more, please welcome Agata Kulig and Konrad Ligas, accompanied by Marta and Monica. Thank you.
here.